Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Robert Aronson. He was the Executive Vice President of the Jewish Federation of Detroit from 1989 to 2009, as well as the Chief Development Advisor of the Federation until his retirement in 2019. During this period, he also held positions as President of Birthright Israel and President of the Steinhardt Foundation for Jewish Life in New York from 2007 to 2014. Enjoy my conversation with Robert Aronson. Bob, thank you so much for joining me. I've really been looking forward to this episode. I say that at the beginning of all of my podcast episodes, but I truly am blessed to speak to people like you who have such interesting and compelling and illustrious careers in many cases in the Jewish world. I think when I look at your resume, I mean, if there's ever a great Jewish world resume, I think yours is up there. I mean, we're talking about the federations, and we're talking about Birthright, and we're talking about the Steinhardt Foundation for Jewish Life, and so on and so forth. Why don't you just give us sort of a snapshot of who you are, where you came from, and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Well, I'll give you a snapshot. I'll try to make it as brief as possible, Josh. I'm from Milwaukee, and I'm an artist by training. Attended Carnegie Mellon and graduated from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So when I discovered the Jewish world, I was a printmaker. And I had no background in Jewish life. I was raised as a Reformed Jew in Milwaukee, as was my whole generation. And the thing that had the greatest impact on me was that my grandfather, Max Feingold, who lived in Janesville, Wisconsin, and had a small little grocery store, made Aliyah to Israel in 1951, the year I was born. And he left behind 5 children after his wife died. After the last one, my mother went to college. He wanted to go and make Aliyah. And he was a strong Zionist. He was also a socialist. And he wanted to be in Israel for the rest of his life. And at that time, once you went to Israel, you didn't come back the way people do today, back and forth all the time. He settled on a kibbutz. At the time, it was called Futzat Sharon, then became Ifat. And when I was 16 years old, I went to visit him. I didn't go on an Israel program. I didn't go with the synagogue or anything else. I just got on an airplane and I went and I stayed with my grandparents, who by that time had moved to Kiryat Tibon. And I lived and worked on kibbutz. And I went back several times. So I ended up spending almost 2 years on Kibbutz Ifat. So my entire Jewish identity as a young American Jew from Milwaukee was to be a Zionist. That's all I knew. And when I returned from Israel after I graduated from the Art Institute in 1975, I was looking for work. And I found a connection with the local Jewish Federation, actually through a girlfriend of mine at the time. And I'll just tell you this one story. I had no skills, obviously, except as an artist, which of course is no skill at all. And I met at that time with the head of the Jewish Federation of Milwaukee, and he said, well, why don't you go and apply as a cartoonist to the local Jewish newspaper, the Wisconsin Jewish Chronicle. So I got an interview with the editor. He said, well, we only hire an artist 2 times a year, and that's for the high holidays, and we don't really need you. And I didn't know how to do cartoons anyway, so that was pretty much out of the picture. I ended up being hired by the Federation, by the executive. His name was Mel Zaret, blessed memory, one of the great early Federation leaders. And he hired me as a clerk typist in September of 1975, and I couldn't type. I still can't type. I actually never used a computer in my whole career, and I couldn't clerk. So I couldn't do either one of those, and I figured I would be out on my tuchus in about 1 month. And then October of 1975 came along, which changed my life forever. And that was when the United Nations passed the Zionism is Racism resolution. And at that time, I was fired up. I was a strong Zionist. Israel was my whole identity. And I organized a rally in Milwaukee. And at that time in Milwaukee, Jews didn't put on rallies. It brought too much attention to the Jewish community. And that was the feeling of the Federation at the time. But I prevailed. And within 2 days, we put on a rally in Milwaukee and had over 1,000 people attend, which was a big number for us in Milwaukee. And I was hooked on working for the Jewish community at that time. And the next day, I became a fundraiser for the Federation. And my boss at the time said, okay, let's try fundraising. And that was kind of how it all started in October of 1975. So now, fast forward, it's almost 50 years in the business.
That's remarkable. Amazing stories. I want to get to what you've been doing sort of in the last 50 years, but I have a question first about Zionism, right? I read a few pieces of literature recently that suggest that we're now in the post-Zionism era. Of course, that's an opinion. There's no real fact or fiction there. When I say post-Zionism, or when you or other people might say we're now in the post-Zionism era, what do you feel and think about that?
Well, I'll tell you a story about my grandmother. Actually, my step-grandmother, when Chaim Feingold settled on Ifat, as I said, he was a socialist. And at that time, back in the 50s and the 60s, you ate all your meals in the Chadar Ochel, and the kids were raised outside of the house, and you didn't own the shirt on your back. And one day there was a vote of the kibbutz membership on whether or not you should be allowed to have a kumkum in your room. And the vote passed.
A kumkum, by the way, just for people that don't know Hebrew, is?
It's an electric tea kettle, water boiler.
Go ahead.
So you could boil water in your room. This was a vote by the kibbutz membership, and it passed. The next day, my grandparents left the kibbutz.
Wow.
And they left the kibbutz because, as far as they were concerned, the Zionist dream was over. So that goes back, we've been talking about the end of the Zionist dream. That was in like the early 60s. And that was sort of the essence of the Zionism that my grandparents practiced, coming out of Russia, moving to the United States, and then making Aliyah totally out of commitment. They even gave up their American citizenship when they moved to Israel at that time, which of course meant that they were completely impoverished when they left the kibbutz because they got no social security. But that was the Zionist ideal at the time. Now, those times have passed. We've been talking about redefining Zionism ever since. But I am, that was my legacy. That's how I learned about Zionism on kibbutz. And I've always held on to that idea, Josh. Has it changed? Are we talking theoretically about post-Zionism? We can talk about everything that's happening within the Jewish state these days, but I still hold fast to the concept that Zionism is at the center of Jewish identity, should be at the center of Jewish identity, and we can never lose that. And when we start using language like post-Zionism, that concerns me, because our identity, certainly as American Jews, which is really the area that I've worked in all these years, for us to lose that connection with the love of Israel, the state of Israel, that has to be our core fundamental value. And when I started out as a fundraiser, by the way, the only thing we raised money for in the local community was Israel. All of the local Jewish institutions, JCCs and family services, vocational, that was all a sideshow. We raised money for Israel. And Israel, in fact, was our Jewish identity for many, many people at the time. That's what fueled the growth of federations. That's what fueled the growth of the United Jewish Appeal at the time. And to this day, certainly in my community of Detroit, that's still an operating principle. Now, we don't fund Israel like we used to, and now we have a completely different relationship with Israel, which is more of a people-to-people relationship, which I think is important. But still, Zionism as Jews, as far as I'm concerned, has to be our core Jewish value.
So that's first of all, I agree personally and philosophically. So yesterday I spoke with a gentleman named Dan Liebenson. I don't know if that name rings a bell to you, but he has an organization called Judaism Unbound. It's the podcast episode before this for people that want to listen to that haven't already. And we were talking about this very same issue. I was saying to him that, Judaism, like it has in the last 4,000 years, has always evolved and transformed and adjusted. And at the same time, in the Jewish world that we live in today, to me, it's very clear that Israel is the Jewish capital of the world. And he said, also an American Jew like both of us, he said, American Jews are just not there anymore. I mean, at least maybe the next generation or certainly more people. And we know that data suggests this as well through certain studies, that less and less people, specifically American Jews in this case, feel that Israel is part of their Jewish identity in a very fundamental way. I think I just read a statistic today, actually, that said about only 50% of Jews, I think it was 35 and under in the US, only 50%, 1 out of every 2, feel that Israel is a core component of their Jewish identity. I'm asking now for you to maybe give us your insight into what's changed and why did we go from a very unequivocal idea of Jewish identity being focused in and around Israel to now 50% of sort of the next generations saying, yeah, I don't need Israel like maybe my parents and my grandparents did to feel and do Jewish?
Well, that's a very long discussion about what has changed in Israel and what has changed in American Jewish perception of Israel. But I will say this, Josh, someone has got to still hold up the standard of what Israel means. And the fact that Israel is the capital of the Jewish world with Jerusalem at its center. And somebody still has to advocate for that. So as long as I'm around, that's what I'm going to do, if anyone pays any attention to me at all anymore. But so much has changed in terms of the identification with Israel. First of all, going from Israel being on the doorstep of elimination, of extinction, and the fight for Jewish survival, which obviously has changed dramatically, to the politics of Israel and the alienation of large segments of the American Jewish community because of the Orthodox laws of Israel, to Israel's wars. The major shift really started taking place after Sabra and Shatila. At that time with Sharon, you saw a marked change in American Jewish attitudes towards Israel. The increasing prosperity of Israel in terms of technology, and I like to tell stories. Elie Wiesel once said, "God made man because he loves stories," and I love stories. So one of my stories is that we used to take missions to Israel, obviously from Federation. In the course of my career, by the way, Josh, I counted it not too long ago. Not counting the times that I lived in Israel, I actually took 75 different missions to Israel over the course of my career. So you can imagine the changes that I saw in Israel during that time. But there was a time when we took missions to Israel where we would not take our missions to places where they had nice houses or where they had nice restaurants. We had to go to development towns. We had to go to places that were impoverished, to sort of the third world part of Israel. We were afraid that if we showed our Jews from America that Israelis had nice houses or nice restaurants or nice businesses, that they would stop giving.
Interesting.
So that's how kind of basic.
That was a calculated decision, just so I'm clear.
That was a calculated decision. Absolutely. I mean, I remember the first time we went into a really nice house in Israel for an event, or we visited, had one of these home visits in a really nice house in a really nice suburb of Tel Aviv. And I was like terrified. I thought, oh my God, what are my donors going to say? They're going to come back and say, well, our Jews in Milwaukee aren't living as nicely as, as the Jews in, Tel Aviv or in Savion or in, wherever. So that was the attitude. We were supposedly the saviors of the Jewish people of Israel. The major line in solicitation was, the Israelis are fighting for our Jewish state, and all we really need to do is provide money. They're the ones whose lives are on the line, which, by the way, is still the story behind IDF fundraising in throughout the world today. But that idea has changed more and more with time. Now you have a modern state. Its survival is not in question. I mean, if you put aside the nuclear threat for a minute, that whole discussion, it is a prosperous country. Tel Aviv is considered one of the great cities in the world to go to, which I completely agree with. And that has changed attitudes, because Jews in my generation, and even certainly the generations prior to mine, grew up with the feeling that Israel needed our money, plain and simple. That's still the narrative coming out of Israel today in many cases, but it's not a narrative that resonates with our younger generation.
Right. So let me
rephrase. And if you put, by the way, let me just finish this, Josh, because I look at my own kids who are in their 30s. If you put support of Israel next to support of in favor of or an advocacy of climate change in the United States, it won't even be a contest.
Right. So let me rephrase the question. How do we get back to a place where more Jews, not just in the US, but everywhere outside of Israel, feel a core part of their Jewish identity is Israel and see Israel as the Jewish capital of the world?
Well, I guess that's why one of the reasons why I became president of Birthright, because I thought, I believe very strongly that to get young people to really appreciate Israel, they have to be in Israel. They have to see Israel. And for all of Birthright's faults, and there were many, look at yourself, Josh. I mean, it changed the lives of literally hundreds of thousands of young Jews. Is it going to make a real impact long term? I don't know, but I also am of the opinion that you can only change one life at a time. It's very hard to change millions of lives. But I hope, looking back on my career and which is now almost 50 years, and looking forward, that somehow we can come up with the ways and means of reinvigorating and recreating the love of Israel in our younger generation. That would be my greatest single hope for the future. I don't know quite how we do it, but we have to have that in front of us as a priority.
Yeah, I agree with that. So,
and not, by the way, to pick apart Israel, theoretically and politically and all of that. I mean, everybody's entitled to their opinions. That's great, but we have to keep this core value in mind.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk about Birthright. You were the president of the foundation. I think back then it was certainly in its infancy compared to what it is today. It's also probably changed a lot since you were in that position. My first question is this. There's a lot of misinformation out there about what is Birthright's agenda or objectives. How would you describe or answer that question?
Well, I have to kind of go back in history. When Michael Steinhardt and Charles Bronfman originally came up with the idea for Birthright Israel, which was a revolutionary and important idea in world Jewish life, the concept was basically to instill the love of Israel in the young people who go, to make it possible for them in large numbers to go to Israel, which is why the free Birthright trip. And further, by being exposed to Israel, to open up and to develop their own Jewish identity back in whatever country or city they came from. That was a more problematic part, Josh, of Birthright. But the assumption at the time was, if we have this huge generation of American Jews who have no Jewish identity and don't really want one. So if they can go to Israel and have a great time and hang out with other like-minded people and come home, that will open up their desire to pursue their own unique Jewish identity. That was the purpose.
Do you feel that Birthright has lived up to its potential in serving that purpose?
No. First of all, I'm not sure any Jewish organization that I've ever known really lives up to its full potential, because that's kind of not the way we're built. But that concept of, first of all, exposing people to Israel, exposing young people to Israel, was not fully realized, because the Israel that they saw was edited, and it was kind of put through the ringer before they saw the Israel that Birthright wanted them to see. And that was problematic. And I think it remains problematic, because if you're going to experience Israel as a young person, you really need to see all of Israel and understand the political situation, warts and all. It's not an ideal, it can't be an idealized experience, because that won't stand up down the road. It won't sustain people down the road to have that idealized view of Israel. Secondly, the efforts to create follow-up to Birthright really did not work. There were many foundations in America that wanted to fund Birthright follow-up programs, but when you got right down to it, the way that young Jews identified, was very much local identification, their friends, their family, their peers, and you really couldn't legislate national follow-up programs. They simply didn't work. So in some cases, like your own, there was a tremendous change in people's lives because of Birthright. In other cases, the result was negative. People had negative experiences and they turned away from Israel. That happened also. By and large, as I meet young Birthright graduates, by and large, I think the experience has been positive for them. And that's a great thing. I mean, we have to go beyond that. And I think Birthright today has to focus more on the reality of the state of Israel and its neighbors and the Palestinian issue. But it's still a significant program for let's call it Zionist education.
Absolutely. So if I gave you the keys to the car, to Birthright's car today, and I said, money's not an issue, ego's not an issue, politics between organizations or within Birthright itself, none of that is an issue. You can do what you want, how you want to do it, with as much money and as much people and other resources as you need. What are some of the things that you would try to implement?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would talk to the people who went on Birthright, not just the leadership of the organizations, not just the heads of the tours, not just the governmental officials in Israel, but I would talk to the graduates. I would probably go on a listening tour and I would say, how would you make Birthright more valuable for you, for your peers? What would it take for Birthright to become a more sustainable Jewish experience? And I'm not sure what the answer would be. The one thing I can guarantee you is, that I could assure you, is that Birthright has to deal more with the reality of the state of Israel today. And the Birthright participants need to meet a broader variety of society in Israel, much broader variety. And it can't always paint a rosy picture. It has to deal with reality today. Because as I said, if not, then these people are going to return to their college campuses or to their communities, and they're not going to have a sustainable Jewish Zionist identity. You have to portray Israel as it is, which means talking to people across the spectrum, even if the stories you hear are not positive stories, and they're not all positive stories.
I guess what I'm hearing from you is the word authenticity, right? If you provide an authentic
experience, it has to be a more authentic experience.
Yeah, which is the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yeah.
one thing, if we look at what happened in the last Gaza war, the last Gaza eruption, Jews on campuses, I come from Detroit, so I have some very large university campuses around the University of Michigan, Michigan State, Wayne State. Jews were frightened on campus of what was taking place. They had no answer to the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism that was taking place on campus. They were literally terrified. And this happened all across the country. So we talk about the rise in anti-Semitic incidents and all the rest of that from the ADL. We know that that's the case. But my real concern was young American Jews who were on their campuses who had nothing to say about Israel because they didn't have the information. Unless young American Jews can see Israel, blemishes and all, used to say, in a more authentic state, they won't be able to deal with the people who call them, dirty names and dirty Zionists and everything else on campus. If you paint only a rosy picture of Israel, there's nothing they can say about it.
Absolutely. And that was one of our goals with Izzy, right? Is, bring the good, the bad, and the ugly through movies and TV shows to the world. And
Absolutely.
say, my theory was, when I started Izzy, was very simple. Generally speaking, 70 to 75% of the full Israeli picture is good. 10 to 15% is bad, and 5 to 10% is ugly. And I think that's a ratio, a proportion that we can live with. But when you only focus on that 70, 75, 80%, and you sort of ignore or sweep under the rug the other 25, 30%, it just feels very misguided and actually can work against you, which I think is basically what you're saying, is that on one hand, you have a group of people, myself included, whose lives have been changed or have had a tremendous experience on Birthright and with Birthright. But then you have this sort of other group that maybe cancels out the former group, which is saying, listen, like, I don't feel like I got the real Israel experience. I don't feel that Birthright and their agenda, so to speak, is aligned with really giving us the experience that is based on reality versus the experience that maybe them and their donors and the Israeli government, for example, it's very clear that there is sort of a inauthentic agenda here. And a lot of younger folks, especially, but not only, when we smell bullshit, which we can smell from a million miles away, we're not too happy about that.
That's exactly right.
I want to go to your comment about, this idea that, I think you said it yourself a few minutes ago, that no Jewish organization has lived up to its potential. I had a conversation with, I won't name them for out of respect, but had a conversation yesterday with the chief marketing officer at what we would call a major Jewish organization. And, she said, you're very hard on the organized Jewish world. She was saying that to me. And I said, damn right I am, because I'm about the pursuit of greatness, not to be confused with the pursuit of perfection. And I feel that I don't judge people based on, and I don't judge myself also based on where I'm at today. I judge people and organizations and myself based on potential. And obviously you're not going to hit your potential 10 times out of 10. But if you can work toward greatness, which I think is, I feel we see a lot of mediocrity in the Jewish world, a lot of average, a lot of B plus maybe, but not, B plus on a good day, not every day. But where's the A? Where's the A plus? Where's the A minus? That to me is what's missing. We see it in the greater world. We see it in the for-profit and nonprofit sectors. In the Jewish world, I told this woman, and I'll say the same thing to you, there's just a lot of mediocrity. And in a world where there's so many options today to go places, to do things, to try things, to study things, to work places, and you're offering mediocrity, like if that's your product effectively, to me, like it starts and stops there. We know money is not an issue in the Jewish world. So let's not say, well, if we had more money, we could produce better stuff, whether it's products, services, or experiences. I think we might have a problem where maybe we have too much money. What do you say to all that?
Well, let me, I mean, we would need like a whole day, Josh, and probably a couple of nights to really get into that. But I will tell you this.
And a few beers.
Yeah, and if you're right, exactly. First of all, if I look back on my own life, and I look back now, sitting out here in the desert of Joshua Tree, California, where you could shoot a howitzer off and not hit a Jew around here. So I have the opportunity, I think, a little bit to kind of reflect on my life and where I've come, also where I'm going. But really, what did I really accomplish as in 50 years in Jewish communal service? And I do call it Jewish communal service. I don't call it Jewish communal leadership, which is another subject we can talk about. But I have served my Jewish community in various ways for 50 years. And I am grateful that I did that. I am truly grateful that I had the opportunity to do this. I was motivated many, many years ago, and one of the reasons I walked into the Federation and asked for a job with no background except as a printmaker and an artist, I read a book which had a huge impact on me. It was called The War Against the Jews, 1939 to 1945, by Lucy Davidovich. And I read extensively in the book about the creation of the Judenrat during the war. And I read about how powerless we were and how we created communal structures. And communal structures were created for us in these ghettos. But there was no light at the end of the tunnel. We were all going to be destroyed. And it really struck me, Josh. It struck me. We created all of these incredible communal structures with schools and plays and culture and relief organizations and whatever. We were doomed. So what would happen if I had a chance to work for a Jewish community? What could I do in this post-war world, post-1945, if you will? What contribution could I make? And that was a major motivation for me to walk into the office of the Federation. I didn't even know what a Federation was. I had no idea. I was just a Zionist, I was a kid who came back from Israel. And so I'm grateful that I have this opportunity in life. But I will also tell you that Jewish organizational life, and I really have to talk only about Jewish communal life in America, specifically in the United States. And it's changing very dramatically. But many Jewish community organizations exist to protect their bureaucracy, to keep doing tomorrow what they did yesterday, to spend a great deal of time justifying their existence, raising money for a purpose which is no longer clear, and no longer, really no longer appropriate. And Jews, by the way, are losing the battle in fundraising with other institutions in the United States specifically that are raising far more dollars from Jews, especially mega donors, than Jewish organizations are. I mean, far more dollars. You look at universities today, you look at museums, you look at even hospitals, medical facilities. The dollars that are going to there from Jewish mega donors far outstrip the amount of money that's going to Jewish organizations. And in many cases, Jewish organizations still have the same mindset today that they had when they were created in the 50s or the 60s. Synagogues are a good example. We built enormous buildings in the 50s and 60s. Because everybody had to go to synagogue, right? And everybody had to be a member of a synagogue. So we have these enormous structures today that are, almost impossible to maintain. And especially now with the pandemic over the last 2 years, there's a lot of Jews who are asking themselves the question, do I really need to walk back into a synagogue again? That's a sea change for synagogue life. But Jewish organizations are loath to really deal with change.
Yeah.
That's the biggest issue, Josh. They don't want to deal with change. And so what happens is the world passes them by.
Yeah, you're totally right.
I
Go ahead.
mean, we still have, I don't want to pick on anyone in particular, but we still have Zionist organizations in the United States, right? Why were Zionist organizations created? They were created to create Aliyah of the American Jewish community in Israel. Well, that horse has left the barn, like when, in the 60s, early 70s? We still have those organizations today. So the American Jewish community, and I can give you, specifics because I certainly am familiar with them, really have entered a period, many of them, of bureaucracy where their job is really to protect themselves.
Right.
Now, in talking about Michael Steinhardt, who I was privileged to serve as president of his foundation for many years, almost 10 years, Michael called out Jewish organizations for this. He was not popular. He was very iconoclastic. Now, people listened to him. He had a lot of money and he put his money where his mouth was. But he called out Jewish organizations and said, why are you still existing? Why do you really need to be around anymore? What do we need to look at that's different? And he created new initiatives. Some worked, like Birthright, some didn't, like Makor. But he truly tried to make change as a major American Jewish philanthropist.
So I want to ask you, not necessarily about Michael Steinhardt specifically, because I'm sure you have a personal relationship that you prefer to keep personal, but mega donors in the Jewish world, sort of, everyone wants their money, of course, but I would say they receive a fair share of criticism, some warranted, some maybe not, maybe some of it's jealousy or other negative feelings. What are I guess, I know primarily you mentioned the fact that you were president of the Steinhardt Foundation for Jewish Life. What are some of the things that we just get completely wrong about mega donors in the Jewish world?
The first thing we get wrong, first of all, let's separate out mega donors who give Jewishly versus Jewish mega donors who don't give Jewishly.
Can you just create that? Can you describe that distinction?
Yeah, mega donors who give Jewishly are, the major foundations, some of them in America that have a Jewish purpose and who fund Jewish causes. But then there's another group of mega donors who are like super mega donors who happen to be Jewish, who do not really fund Jewish issues. So those are two very different kinds of donors. Among mega Jewish donors who fund Jewish things, I also worked during the course of my career for several people who were or who became mega Jewish donors. One in particular is I was privileged to work for 8 years with a man named William Davidson of Detroit, whose foundation now created a foundation, most of it after his passing, of more than $1 billion, which may be a small foundation by today's standards, but still pretty big by Jewish standards. And he made a commitment that a majority of his money should go to Jewish causes. That's pretty rare, Josh, still among mega donors. There's an old Chabad expression, I don't know if you've heard it or not, that God must hate money because look at who he gives it to. And have you ever heard that one before? It's kind of, I sort of use it from time to time when I'm speaking, especially when I'm speaking to my students at the University of Michigan, to understand that just because people have money, even a great deal of money, doesn't mean they're going to support your organization. That may sound really simple, but it's not. And one of the reactions of Jewish organizations, when they see a Jew who, let's say, gives $100 million to a university, what is the Jewish reaction? You know what it is? It's, oh, that's terrible. How come he didn't give it to us? Well, it's because you didn't deserve it. You didn't establish the relationship. You haven't got the same product that university has. So we as Jewish organizations are not entitled to Jewish money. That's the single biggest thing you have to overcome in sort of the mindset of Jewish organizations in the United States, you have to go out and earn it. And that means that you have to go out and you have to create programs, ideas, innovations, new approaches that are going to attract mega donors.
Interesting.
You know, in a previous generation, and I was really privileged in my life to work with the giants of Jewish philanthropy, such as Max Fisher of Detroit, and William Davidson of Detroit, and others. I could go on and on. But their attitude towards giving Jewishly, Josh, was, you know, America has been good to me, and I'm going to return the favor by becoming a philanthropist, and I'm going to start with my own community. That attitude doesn't exist anymore. Okay? The attitude today on the part of mega donors and their foundations is, okay, show me the measurables, show me the impact, show me what you have actually accomplished. Give me the, give me the spreadsheet. I don't even really know what a spreadsheet is. That was after my time, but major sources of Jewish funding today are asking the questions, what can you actually produce for me? And who else can you get to join me in producing this program or producing this outcome? And it's no longer, where I can walk into someone's office and say, the Jews are in trouble and I need your money. And that's how I was raised, Josh, as a fundraiser.
Interesting.
The Jews are in crisis. Give me your money.
So I'm glad you brought up Marty Stein and Max Fisher.
Yeah, Marty Stein was a great one.
Because actually you wrote an article, I think it was back in 2008, literally called On Jewish Leadership. So I read the article. That's how I heard about you and reached out to you. And now we're doing the podcast. I bring up the article because, first of all, the article is fascinating. First of all, the entire magazine that the article was part of, which was On Jewish Leadership, I think was ahead of its time. This was back in 2008. Still very much relevant today. If anyone wants to check it out, just Google Contact Magazine. It's volume 11, number 1 from the Journal of the Steinhardt Foundation for Jewish Life. But I bring up the article, Bob, because you really specialize in leadership and Jewish leadership. And I understand now you're doing some consulting work in that realm. Last question for you, because I know we're up against time. Can you just take us into intro to Jewish leadership? What are some of the key points, some of the things that you start talking about when you get into that topic?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question, because I do spend a lot of time thinking about it and reflecting on it. And I think, Josh, and I talk with one of my clients on a regular basis about what is Jewish leadership. And I think that there are really 3 key elements to whether you're a professional Jewish leader or a communal leader, a lay leader. There are really 3 basic components to great Jewish leadership. And by the way, we overuse the word leadership all the time. So it actually means nothing. So I would like maybe on this podcast to get people to start thinking in much more narrow terms about what Jewish leadership is, so we know who the real leaders are and how to develop them in our communities. The 3 major points for me are humility, judgment, and listening. I always say that one thing I've tried never to do in my professional career is use the pronoun I, because it's never about me. To be a great leader, it has to be about others. And you have to be willing to sublimate your ego. Now, egos are important in order to be a leader. You have to have an ego. You can't be without it, but you have to be able to deal with it and sublimate it to the point where other people are involved in the decision-making, and you encourage others by empowering them and making them feel good about what they're doing. Not about polishing your own ego. And that's a very difficult thing for professional Jewish leaders, for the rabbinate, for communal leaders to do, especially in this age, Josh, of major Jewish foundations, where the leaders of our past, in the time of Eastern Europe and Jewish communities in Poland and so on, when Jews who were leaders by virtue of their Jewish knowledge. Now we have in America leaders who are there by virtue of their wealth. And we confer upon them the title of leader, even though it is oftentimes not deserved. And so many of the heads of major foundations, including their professional staff, think of themselves as, today's generation of the princes of Israel. And that's not the way to view leadership. That's not what leadership is. It's number one about humility. It's about judgment, knowing when to act and when not to act, when to speak and when not to speak. How to develop a community long-term, not just what we need to accomplish this morning. And the ability to really listen to what people are saying and what their concerns are and to respond to it is a skill that's often really missing from many of today's Jewish leadership, because their attitude is, I know what's right. I know what's important. I know what we have to do, and you don't. And again, we have a tendency in American Jewish life to invest our wealthy people with the role of leader. That is simply not enough. To be a true leader, yes, sometimes you need financial capacity, okay, because that's how we operate in America, to fund our organizations. So you need the financial capacity, but you need the judgment and you need the humility in order to really lead. And in my practice today, that's what I work with my people on, and my clients are involved in vastly different Jewish organizations, nationally and even internationally. But those are when you get right down to it, if I really want to sort of put it through the sieve and winnow it down, those are the qualities that I think are most important. And I also think, if I can go on for a couple more minutes, I also think when I look at the future of American Jewish life, I'm optimistic. I believe that, millennials and whatever that new generation is that came after them, which I can't remember what do we call them?
I think it's Gen Z.
Yeah, Gen Z, right. A lot of people say, well, they're useless. They're not like the past generation. They don't care about being Jewish. The hell with them. They don't give to us anymore. That's the wrong attitude. So Jewish organizations, and we talked about it earlier, that become bureaucratized and stuck in the way they were in the past, are threatened by the new Jews in America. Well, instead of being threatened by them, why don't we reach out to them and find out what it is that they want in Jewish life? I am a real strong believer my whole life. And even coming from an ultra-reform background and no real Jewish knowledge, and no knowledge of my traditions, which I've tried to accumulate more of over the years. But I've always believed in the fact that my Jewish identity is central to my being. That's absolutely essential to my being. I say that in the morning, I say it at night. I ask, what can I do to be a better Jew today? That's my personal statement, Josh, that I've learned to do over all of these years. And I would like to find a way to inculcate that and to give that to a new generation of American Jews. That our Jewishness and our Zionism, which is fundamental to our Jewishness, is central to who I am as a human being. I believe in our future. I believe that we can accomplish this. But I believe that it is going to require a new generation and new thinking about what Jewish leadership is for the future.
Amen. Well, Bob, this has been very insightful. episode for me. I'm sure for the listeners as well. I want to really thank you for your time. You've really been a treasure to the Jewish world the last 50 years. I think you, by the looks of it, I mean, people that are listening can't see you. By the looks of it, I think you have another 15, 20 years left in you, more or less.
Well, it's whatever Hashem wills, but I really appreciate, Josh, I appreciate you finding me, because out here in the desert, I feel like nobody could ever find me. So I appreciate you finding me out here in Joshua Tree. I appreciate the chance to talk. This is a subject that I live with every day, and I eat and breathe it. And I really appreciate the chance to talk to you, and I hope we'll talk again in the future.